Compelling. That's the word that I keep thinking of. It's 2022, it's my first time ever playing a Dark Souls game, or any Souls-like game really, and the thought that is consistently popping into my mind as I make my way through it is, why am I so compelled to complete this game? So to back up for a second, it's probably important to mention that there's a reason I have not played Dark Souls or any of its many sister games until now, and that's because there's quite a bit about it that I don't typically enjoy or look for in games. Inflated difficulty, dreary visuals, clunky movement, elements of min-maxing stats and equipment. And after playing through the game, I still don't enjoy those aspects of it, but I did find it to be an engaging experience despite all of those things. And especially despite the fact that it doesn't even do a lot of them very well. It's no surprise to hear that the original Dark Souls is not exactly a refined experience. At least I don't know of anyone who would argue that specific point. The flawed masterpiece moniker that's so often stamped on this game feels like a bit of a sensationalized way to say, hey, this game is good, and it's also not very good. Listen, this just is a flawed game, there's no doubt about it. There are enough questionable design decisions and mechanical pitfalls present in Dark Souls that I would not argue with a single person who would classify it as poorly made. And I certainly don't blame anyone who simply doesn't want to put in the time to see if maybe it will click for them. But it's a flawed game that's surrounded by some really intriguing pieces, and it builds a foundation that's strong enough to have spawned an entire subgenre, leading all the way up to the massive launch of Elden Ring earlier this year. And because of this, the entire franchise has managed to create a remarkable version of a shared experience for an entire generation of gamers. And that shared experience is the most confident reason that I can come up with as to why in 2022 I was so compelled to play and complete an 11-year-old unpolished, janky epic of a game. So I had problems writing the script for this video because the first two drafts included me detailing everything that's wrong with Dark Souls, and it was a lot. During my playthrough of the game, I took over 6 pages of notes, and I calculated this. 78% were what I would consider critical of the game. That's an astonishing number. That's a number that would usually cause me to just stop playing a game. But as we'll soon find out, there's something very unusual about Dark Souls. Those first drafts of the script ended up sounding like a venting session about everything that Dark Souls does poorly. And that's not what I want this video to be. The problem is, if I don't go into detail about the game's issues, I'm providing no evidence as to why the things it doesn't do well are a problem. And more importantly, in order to highlight how powerful the gravitational pull behind this series has become, I think it's important to contrast that with the actual mechanical experience of playing the game, which is less than stellar. In the end, I had to strike a balance, finding a bizarrely contradictory way to discuss why this game is terrible, but great, but also so bad, but also totally engrossing and will take over your life. Because ultimately, that's what Dark Souls is, a bizarrely contradictory experience, one that had me often hating the minute-to-minute gameplay, but loving the bigger picture upon looking back. So yes, in order to do that, we've got to start with the ugly stuff. But my goal here is to actually provide some substance behind the game's issues in a way that both fans and detractors of the game can relate to. There will certainly be some sarcasm and saltiness present in this section, but I honestly think that's the best way to write a critique of Dark Souls. The entire game is basically one big deliberate f*** you to the player that just also happens to be weirdly enjoyable. It's the epitome of a love-hate relationship, so now that I've had an opportunity to reflect, that's exactly what this section of the video will be. Here we go. Let's talk about some general presentation issues first, keeping in mind that I'm looking at this from a modern-day lens. The game doesn't look great. Repetitive textures are ugly and fail to create what could be a pretty inspiring world. Also, let's be clear that being dark is not a graphical feature, not even when you put it in the name of the game. And it's not just the darkness that's the problem, it's the inconsistency in lighting. So at certain brightness settings, some areas look fine and others you can barely see in front of you. Meanwhile, the illumination coming from your character is unreliable as well, causing weird pockets of light and dark to be cast in front of you depending on the architecture and the environment. Animations are also pretty rough at this point. Player movement is rigid and unnatural, and why does it look like my guy's about to snap his ankle in half when he's running? Even the iconic Estus flask animation is bizarre. The net length of the animation is deliberately long, and there's no problem there, but the motion of drinking the flask itself happens incredibly quickly, so your character just awkwardly stands there the rest of the time. I know that sounds like a small thing, but in this game, small things matter. Little frustrations like helplessly watching your character get cut down because the developers couldn't be bothered to smooth out an animation, those moments add up. More importantly though, some of the animations also create a huge problem for the actual combat in Dark Souls, but that'll be discussed a bit later. Lastly, the sound mixing is all over the place. Why are my footsteps so loud and this character's voice line is so soft? Many times throughout my playthrough I could hear the sounds of enemies walking around as if they were stomping directly on my head, only to find out they're actually 2 floors up and 100 yards away. So this is an 11-year-old game, and some of these graphical and sound issues are to be expected with general aging. But the bigger reason for highlighting these problems now is that it's a perfect introduction to one of the game's biggest flaws: its almost entire lack of polish. This game feels like a prototype. It feels unfinished, and because the inconsistencies you experience happen with such frequency and affect nearly every system in the game, that can feel incredibly frustrating. So the bigger question is, how does that all affect the way the game plays and feels? Well, let's start that discussion by talking about the deaths. The many deaths you'll experience throughout the course of this game. Obviously, going into my playthrough, I was expecting the degree of difficulty that Dark Souls would present, especially for someone who's never truly touched a game of this type. I came into it with as much patience as I could to give it a fair shot, knowing that this aspect of the game could easily turn me off if it wasn't handled properly on my part. And despite that preparation, it certainly handed my ass to me on more than a few occasions. And that's fine. And in fact, it's actually kind of cool. The fact that there's really nothing you can do to prepare yourself for the Dark Souls experience is actually a pretty impressive design feat. You just have to go through it and hopefully get better at it along the way. The same way that everyone else does. Remember that point. So to some extent, I was expecting what this game provides from a difficulty standpoint. But what I was not expecting was the ways in which that difficulty is inflated due to the game being all kinds of unpolished. One of the main traits that Dark Souls has become known for is the importance of its punishing but fair gameplay. The fact that yes, it's challenging, yes, it can be frustrating, but it's never unfair or cheap. In other words, every time the player dies, it's due to something they did wrong. A misjudgment on their part to be corrected and recorrected with each successive try. And when you finally do overcome each challenge, it's because you have successfully mastered the inputs, the strategy, and the reactions necessary to become better. It turns out that's not actually true at all. So, what? This game does plenty of things that cause you to fail that are no fault of your own. And it does them consistently enough that it truly is a detractor from the experience. It also turns out that this isn't really my opinion. In fact, the greater Dark Souls community is completely aware of this. They just don't care, because the rest of the game is rewarding enough to them that it makes up for it. And that's one of the things that's so interesting about this game. This is not a niche title that a small population of people enjoy for its brutal gameplay. This is a massively popular game that spawned 2 direct sequels, 3 successors, and countless other imitators. And when this game throws something at you that feels totally out of your control, the most common reaction from fans is, LOL, try again, I guess. That's incredible. And I'm saying that sincerely. Like, how many other games have that kind of power in which all of the things wrong with it are not just tolerated, but actually become part of what fans like about it? Let's take the controls as an example. The slow and delayed control system this game implements is not the problem here. That's not bad design. It's just something you have to adapt to. Dark Souls is certainly not the only game to use this type of system, And in fact, some games use delayed inputs or long animations as a deliberate way to provide a challenge up front, but a satisfying result when it works. The problem here is that in order to implement that philosophy, the controls need to be consistent, and the controls in Dark Souls are not. The main light and heavy attacks are fine, they do what they're supposed to do, but the alternate attacks like the kick, the jump attack, and their many variations depending on the weapon you have equipped are, to put it plainly, a huge failure. They're already bound to a strange input on your controller, but that input is given such little forgiveness in timing, it makes those attacks so inconsistent they're not even worth using. Because in this game, if one attack goes wrong, that can be your life. That means I played through the entire game barely ever using these attack methods, because why risk it? This game rewards players for sticking to a reliable plan, and punishes players for taking risks. So if I know I have consistent main attacks, and I know there's a pretty decent chance my attempts at alternate attacks are just flat out not going to work, why would I ever try to implement that tactic? The same can be said about parrying in this game. Because the window to land a parry can be so small, and the consequence of a failed parry so large, it's almost never worth attempting unless you're willing to spend the time it takes to memorize every single new enemy's parry point. And the only way to practice that all but requires you to die over and over again, on top of all the times you're already doing that. So is it ever worth mastering that technique for a casual player? Others may feel differently, but for me, the answer was a resounding no. And all of this combined means that half of the game's intended combat system is essentially made obsolete, simply because the developers struggled so much with implementing a reliable control scheme. How about the enemy encounters themselves? Well, there's issues there too. Certain combinations of level design and enemy type result in situations that are a chore to deal with. Like this area in the Tomb of the Giants, where I had to choose between using a shield to help protect myself or using a lantern to, be able to see anything. And I don't even have to mention this encounter by name for anyone who's played the game. These areas rarely felt fun to me. They felt like an annoyance rather than a true challenge, though I suppose that's a subjective issue. But when enough of these moments are strung together, that can make the entire game feel like a drudging experience. But the bigger problem with enemy encounters has to do, once again, with major inconsistencies, this time regarding animations and hitboxes. There are attacks from enemies that utilize collision detection that is wildly different than what their animations would indicate. This happens most frequently during attempts at dodge rolls, which to my knowledge has been changed significantly after this game, but the problem shows up in plenty of other ways as well. Every single person who's ever played this game has likely had several moments in which they get unexpectedly wrecked by an enemy attack and think to themselves, wait, how did that hit me? Here's the secret. It probably didn't. LOL, try again, I guess. Now I've seen this point made before and the response is often this. The hitboxes aren't bad, you just have to learn the attacks and know where they hit. In other words, I have to spend time adapting my method of playing to correct for a poor piece of design that is literally invisible. And the messed up philosophy behind that idea is one of the biggest issues with Dark Souls. That is that the game gets to punish the player in ways that shouldn't be possible, but the player has no recourse for it. They just have to get up and try again. In other words, Dark Souls gets to screw up, but Dark Souls players do not. Things like this don't happen too often, but when they do, it's so visually obvious that it feels like a slap in the face, making it all the more frustrating. And this is maybe the more important piece of this, because honestly, most of the game's hitboxes are fine. Most of the times you die are going to be your fault, and no game is going to be perfect at this, but again, Dark Souls asks for perfection from the player. So every time you get grabbed by an enemy despite being several feet from the edge of their reach, or you get destroyed by the swing of a sword that went through 3 solid trees to hit you, it becomes abundantly clear that the game is not actually playing by the same rules. Dark Souls gets to screw up, Dark Souls players do not. But enough of that, because now it's time for the most egregious offender of absolute jank found in Dark Souls. The camera system. It's not good. It's just bad. It's really bad. The weird part of this to me is that the combat system seems to always be discussed as if it exists in isolation, but it doesn't. That's not how games work. So even if the entirety of the combat system worked as intended and none of the issues I just highlighted ever occurred, the camera would still be bad, and the camera is a part of the combat system. And unfortunately, you'll be fighting to correct it pretty much your entire playthrough, especially in areas that have a lot of protruding architecture or closed off sections with tight turns. This is sometimes made even worse by a terribly inconsistent lock-on system, which at times has no problem picking up on the correct enemy, and other times will completely miss one directly in front of you. But it gets better, because a missed lock-on causes the camera to readjust behind your character. Which means in these situations, not only does it not put the camera on the enemy, it will instead swing the camera around, causing you to not be able to see that enemy at all. Not what you want in a Dark Souls game. And lastly, maybe the most obvious piece of design that proves that FromSoftware doesn't actually care about you or your well-being. And that is that nothing is ever explained. Now, I'm not talking about story or characters. I mean full gameplay systems are never taught to the player. What do these symbols mean? Don't know. What the hell is humanity? Don't know. What are covenants? How do I use the ascension system? What's the difference between being hollow and unhollow? None of this is ever explained, meaning you have to gamble on trial and error in a game that punishes anything but strategic precision. This is bonkers. This is a game that almost requires research in order to enjoy fully and certainly to understand. There is so much that is inexplicably hidden from the player. And because in-game resources can be tough to come by, most times you don't feel comfortable experimenting with these systems to figure them out, even though that's the only way to do it.
Bonkers.
Alright, admittedly, it did feel kind of good to say all those things out loud. But after I played this game, I did my best to research a lot of these issues because, I don't know, maybe it was just me. Maybe I was missing things. And it would be highly embarrassing to create an entire video on something that it turns out I just didn't understand. But what I found was that, once again, not only do all of these problems exist, but most rational fans of the game are completely aware of them. The unreliable attacks and parries, the unexplained gameplay mechanics, the inconsistent lock-on system, the brightness setting. None of these are contentious topics among the Dark Souls community. I could not find reasonable people who debate whether or not these problems exist. The debate is about whether or not it matters that they exist. Because the overwhelming response to most of this game's flaws is, that's just the way it is. That's what Dark Souls is. And while I don't think that's a valid excuse for these problems to be present, I do think it's a mostly reasonable explanation as to why so many people enjoy this game. Because even with the omnipresent lack of polish, Dark Souls also does some things very well. And to many people, these strengths not only outweigh the weaknesses, they do so in an exceedingly influential way. The game takes an extremely simplistic combat system and develops it into a maze of deep options and unique builds. The moveset available to the player at the beginning of the game is exactly the same as what they'll be using at the end. Yet for the most part, this system remains engaging throughout, even with half of it being essentially unusable. This is because variety is introduced not through upgrades or increasingly complex abilities, but through enemy engagements and differing character builds. If you don't like the idea of mastering a simple system, you'll likely find this repetitive, especially considering the amount of times you'll be repeating enemy encounters. But if this methodical style of play clicks with you, Dark Souls does it pretty well. The interconnecting world design of the game is often praised, and I do think that piece is a highlight here. There's something extremely satisfying about making your way deeper and deeper into an area, further and further away from the last bonfire, carefully picking apart enemies and patiently peeking around each corner to make sure you're safe, and then suddenly opening a door, activating an elevator, or unlocking a passage that leads you safely to a familiar destination that you had no idea was even close by. It's really well done. The funny thing is that aesthetically, there's nothing comforting about this world. It's a dreary, depressing place through and through. But by presenting the feeling of familiarity after long periods of anxiety-inducing exploration, FromSoftware is able to manufacture a feeling of comfort when these moments occur. It's not something that hasn't been done before. It's a technique that games like Metroids and Resident Evils have been using for a long time. But due to the difficulty and extreme levels that Dark Souls takes this idea, the moments of relief feel that much better. And a lot of these moments are facilitated by periods of smart design and well thought out exploration. This game is at its best when you're able to strategically and meticulously work your way through an area, carefully taking out enemies one by one after having studied their behavior and patterns. It's in these bits that Dark Souls feels almost like a hybrid between an action game and a strategy game, and it can be incredibly satisfying. Unfortunately, the game also adores areas that are the opposite of this. Closed-off corridors that leave little room for strategic movement, filled with swarming enemies that leave little time for planning. These sections ask you to quickly react rather than carefully plan, and the combat and camera system are not built for that type of design. But when it fires correctly, the interaction between level design, combat systems, and enemy encounters hits another gear that a lot of games never achieve. Another accomplishment that's really a byproduct of the Dark Souls formula is that over the course of your playthrough, you become intimately familiar with its world in a way that doesn't often happen in other games. In linear, level-based games, we're so used to traveling quickly from point A to B through throwaway sections we never see again. And large open-world games are filled with expansive but non-remarkable environments that oftentimes look and feel similar and usually just act as space to travel through, meaning you'll never become familiar with the environment in the way you do in a Dark Souls game. For better or for worse, you're going to know the layout of every single area in this game. And then you're going to know it again, and again, and again. Lastly, I just really dig how weird this game can be. Some of the bosses in particular are just awesome, and even though the environments don't look great, a lot of them still have their own eerie atmosphere that does a good job differentiating each one from the next. There's clearly a lot of creativity flowing through this studio, and I'm so glad that this is one of the pieces that has at least been attempted to be replicated in the game's many iterations by other developers. All of these are pretty clear and easily documented strengths of this game, and I'm confident that they're a large part of what makes it enjoyable. But there's something else going on here. Something that's a little less tangible that's formed over the past decade, starting with this game's predecessor, Demon's Souls, and continuing to this day with the release of Elden Ring. So when I'm playing through a game, I usually wait until I finish it before going on to read reviews, watch videos, or hear other opinions on it. With Dark Souls, I found myself wanting to race through the game just so that I could do that. I had heard the hype surrounding these games over the past decade, and now that I was finally delving into a piece of that hype, I wanted to become a part of that shared experience. This is the power of what is essentially the gaming mythos this franchise has created. The excitement, the chatter, and the influence surrounding these games exercises a sort of control over the player, or at least it did for me. It compelled me to continually press through a game that I sometimes really enjoyed and other times really didn't. It caused me to ignore every other game I could be playing to instead focus only on Dark Souls, and it allowed me to bargain with the game's many frustrating flaws to keep my attention till the end. At this point, the idea of a Souls-born game has become bigger than just the individual titles themselves. It's evolved into a piece of gaming culture unique to our generation and time frame. The sheer number of games inspired by the success of Dark Souls could be likened to the bevy of Doom clones that followed that game's release, or the countless 3D platformers that tried to recapture the magic of Mario 64. What's more is that oftentimes people talk down on these attempts of imitation, fiercely defending the original games as the kings of the genre. And this type of attitude, though usually baseless, only further develops the mythology surrounding these occurrences. It creates a protective barrier, cementing games like Doom, Mario, and Dark Souls as important pieces of gaming history. It's part of why the original Dark Souls is considered by many to be an all-time classic, despite being a highly flawed experience. This impact on the greater culture and the psychology of its participants isn't something that's unique to gaming. It's similar to the feeling of tuning into a major sporting event like the Super Bowl and knowing that millions of others are sharing the exact same experience at the exact same time. For those of us who grew up during the peak of the Harry Potter phenomenon, we remember fans who waited in line at bookstores at midnight for the next title in the series to officially be released. Yes, that's partially because they wanted to read it as soon as possible, but it's also because they were sharing a unique, once-in-a-generation experience with others, both physically around them and more broadly, around the world. I imagine this is also similar to what people experienced during Beatlemania and the unparalleled excitement of 4 musicians from Liverpool absolutely taking over the world. It's an unmistakable and unreplicable energy that can only be created by these types of shared moments. And while I'm not exactly comparing FromSoftware to the Beatles, there's no doubt in my mind that a large part of my enjoyment of Dark Souls was tied to and elevated by this phenomenon. At about hour 60 into this game, I did start to get fatigued. Now that may sound like a bad thing, but another way to phrase that is, I played this game for 60 hours before feeling like I needed to take a break. And when I did, guess what happened? There's a game you may be familiar with called Hollow Knight that I could never get into despite giving it 3 different tries in about 12.5 hours of my time. This is a game that's superbly polished, that's known for its extremely tight controls, an expansive and interconnected world, and a variety of challenging boss fights. But the environments never inspired me much, and I was turned off by the spikes in difficulty coupled with the excessively long boss runs. Well, during my break from Dark Souls, I decided to give Hollow Knight one more try. And I enjoyed it. It finally stuck, and in about 1 week I put in more hours than I had in those previous 3 attempts combined. Was this because Dark Souls caused me to change my approach to Hollow Knight and to play with more patience and precision? Or was it that Dark Souls had just beaten me into appreciating the principles and systems that these 2 games share? I don't have an answer to that, and honestly, it was probably a combination of both. But I can promise you it was also because I wanted to share in the over-the-moon experience that so many others have had with this game. And Dark Souls was the catalyst for finally allowing me to do that. During this break, I also finally made it to a bucket list game that I've wanted to try out for years. Castlevania Symphony of the Night. For those of you interested in the review of that one, here it is. Absolute tale of 2 games. The first half, ton of fun. The second half, painfully obvious it was not designed to be a functioning game. Sorry, I've still got this Dark Souls energy raging through me. The point is that it was fascinating to see how much Symphony of the Night inspired the Souls series. Things like the expertly crafted connections between regions of the world, the freedom to choose different weapon styles within one combat system, the atrocious user interface. Good God, look at this. Like, this isn't just bad by today's standards, this was horrible all the way back in 1997. And Symphony of the Night can certainly stand on its own achievements, but the intrigue surrounding Souls games that I now had after having played 60 hours of Dark Souls created an even richer experience of this PlayStation classic. And that actually made me feel okay about missing out on this one for so many years. Because I can totally see how this was probably an incredible game to experience when it was first released, and I'll never have that experience. I'm not able to go back in time and play this within that historical context. But I was able to experience it within my historical context, during this period of resurgence and evolution of the game's genre, during a time when I'm looking at games more critically and understanding what makes them tick. There's comfort in that. And Dark Souls was the catalyst for finally allowing me to do that. Eventually, I obviously went back to finish my Dark Souls playthrough, and while it never quite hooked me in the same way it did during the first stretch of playing, that word compelling still kept popping into my mind. I wanted to complete this game, despite all of its flaws and frustrations, so that I could share in the experiences, the hype, the complaints and debates that surround this game and everything it has led to since. So is Dark Souls worth playing in 2022 and beyond? Absolutely yes. And also, not really. There's no game I could ever universally recommend to everyone and have a perfect hit rate, but Dark Souls I think tests that idea more than maybe any other game I've ever played. There's too many variables seared into this game's DNA that are going to have an effect on the way it may impact you. Maybe you're like me and have never played a Soulslike game before. If you have the time and patience to commit to a sometimes hair-pulling experience, and if that experience compels you enough to keep playing, then I think this can be a great piece of gaming history to enjoy. But if you're wanting to try out what this genre has to offer as a whole, then Dark Souls is likely a terrible starting point. There's just too many things that are too unrefined to call this a solid representation of what these games have become. Or maybe you've played plenty of these games, or maybe just jumped into this style due to the release of Elden Ring, and now want to go back to experience one of the genre's origin pieces. Well, if you're just fueled by everything that Souls-likes bring to the table and want to dive into everything they have to offer, then Dark Souls does enough good things even today that you'll find something to like about it. But that genre has also evolved, so if you're used to that modern, polished experience that it's turned into today, you might be highly turned off by the very primitive nature of the original Dark Souls. As I said earlier in this video, I don't blame anyone who doesn't like this game. I don't buy applying the "you just don't get it" argument to a game that throws this much garbage at you, and it's clear there's even many fans of this franchise who don't necessarily like this game despite appreciating what it is and what it did. But after finally playing Dark Souls myself, I can say that I now understand the powerful pull that this franchise has, that it's ignited and reinvigorated my interest in other games that share some of its qualities, and that I feel at least a little like I'm a part of this enormous shared experience that has swept across the gaming world at this single point in history. And that's what has made every frustrating death a little less painful.